Black Wall Street, built by Black people for Black people. In May of this year, 100 years since the Tulsa massacre, 107-year-old Viola Fletcher testified in front of Congress. I would like to read to you what she had to say. On May 31st of 1921, I went to bed in my family's home in Greenwood. The neighborhood I fell asleep in that night was rich, not just in terms of wealth, but in culture and heritage. My family had a beautiful home. We had great neighbors. I had friends to play with. I felt safe. I had everything a child could need. I had a bright future. Then, she said, came the murderous rampage, still vivid in her mind 100 years later. I still see Black men being shot, Black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and I see fire. I still see Black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. So how did one city with humble beginnings turn into the epicenter of racial violence? Let's get into it. A quiet town formerly owned by Native Americans was turned into a bustling city in Tulsa. O.W. Gurley started a boarding house in Greenwood in 1906, which would be the beginning of an all-Black-owned district. He would lend other aspiring business owners money to start up in Greenwood. Word began to travel, and soon there would be the largest Black-owned hotel in the country, built by J.B. Johnson. Tulsa Star, the city's newspaper, which informed African Americans of their legal rights, was being published by A.J. Smitherman. Grocery stores, restaurants, salons, nightclubs, and everything in between. Greenwood had its own school system, post office, a bank, hospitals, and bus and taxi services. A city completely reliant on its own residents was flourishing. An upscale community of people who were seen as an inferior race of the time quickly became the target of racial injustice. Before getting into the events of the riot, it is important to understand the complexities of this time. Lynching, states' restrictions on voting access for African Americans, and the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan were prevalent. Jim Crow laws were in effect, white supremacy was rapid, and segregation was progressing at alarming rates. The Red Summer of 1919, where anti-Black riots erupted in cities across the country, including Tulsa, added to the tension. Because of these riots, the Tulsa Star would encourage the residents of Greenwood to flock to courthouses where African American people were to stand on trial to help guard them from white mobs trying to harm them. This would, unfortunately, cause the end of the quiet lifestyle of those in Greenwood. In 1921, when 19-year-old Dick Rowland, a Black shoe shiner, was accused of attempted sexual assault of a 17-year-old white elevator operator named Sarah Page, a group of 75 armed Black men went to the courthouse to ensure Dick's safety, but were met with around 1,500 white men demanding Dick Rowland to be handed over. After shots were fired and tensions rising, the outnumbered Black men retreated to Greenwood. Mobs of armed white men descended after them. May 31st to June 1st, 1921, became known as the Tulsa Massacre, one of the worst incidents of racial violence in U.S. history. For 18 hours, armed white mobs terrorized the neighborhood of Greenwood. They were looting homes, burning down businesses, flying airplanes that were dropping dynamite, and shooting Black residents dead. By the time the National Guard rolled in, almost 1,300 homes and businesses were burnt to the ground, including a school, a library, a hospital, churches, hotels, stores, and many other Black-owned businesses. A 2001 State Commission examination of events was able to confirm 36 dead, 26 Black, and 10 white. Historians believe, though, that as many as 300 perished during the massacre. Over 800 people were treated for injuries, and 6,000 Black Tulsans were imprisoned and held at the convention hall and the fairgrounds, some for as long as 8 days. In total, 35 blocks were left in ruin, and bodies were being thrown in mass grave sites or the river. Hours after the Tulsa Massacre, all charges on Dick Rowland were dropped. If this was one of the worst cases of racial injustice, why have most of us never heard of it? The answer is simple. Government officials in Oklahoma didn't want you to know. Partly because civil officials selected many men, all of them white, and some of them participants in that violence, and made those men their agents as deputies. Instead of bringing the end to the violence, they only added to it. Public officials provided firearms and ammunition to individuals. Again, all of them white. Units of the Oklahoma National Guard participated in the mass arrest of all or nearly all of Greenwood's residents. No government at any level offered adequate assistance, if any at all, to what amounted to the destruction of the Greenwood neighborhood. Local newspapers removed the stories of the massacre from their bound volumes, and it was discovered that police and state militia archives about the riot were missing. In fact, the residents of Greenwood were accused of starting the violence that tried to end their community. To this day, not one person has been prosecuted or punished for the devastation and the ruin of the original Greenwood. The lasting effects of the massacre still haunt Greenwood to this day. While some businesses were able to rebuild, most never gained the same success. A lot of the families left Tulsa in general because of the emotional and physical pain left, and some fled Oklahoma because they were accused of being the perpetrators of the riot. In present-day Greenwood, a century later, it is much poorer than the rest of Tulsa. The pain of the Tulsa Race Massacre still burns in the city. In conclusion, Black Wall Street started because of the effects of segregation. It was a vibrant and wealthy Black-owned city that relied on its own people. When white supremacy was so prevalent, Greenwood had the cards stacked against them. They fought violently, but in the end, the massacre took everything. The 35 blocks that once held success and hope was left burnt and blood-stained.